Hey, I'm just going to here be giving an overview of the early Marx 101 course. This will be the next course I teach at Philosophy Portal, which is, of course, focusing on Marx's early works, specifically from the 1840s. And the logic of this course is basically extending Philosophy Portal's work, which, of course, starts with Hegel, working through the German idealist tradition. And inevitably, you become haunted by or you feel the necessity to approach the work of Marx. And I think that this course will be giving an interesting window into not only the early Marx, but the dialectic between Hegel and Marx, the dialectic between, let's say, German idealism and the Marxist tradition, which, from my point of view, has so many tension points and has such high consequences and stakes that I felt like this course required a full year to totally unpack and to work through. So you can sign up here. It is starting with the critique of the philosophy of right, and actually is structured in such a way as that we are going to be going into multiple works by Marx, including the critique of the philosophy of right, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the German ideology, wage, labor, and capital, as well as the Communist Manifesto. And you can see the schedule here. It will be unfolding basically with events once a month. I think that unfolding this course on a month by month basis is going to give us more time to digest these works, reflect on these works, and hopefully by the end of the year have a much deeper understanding of what Marx was responding to, both philosophically in the German idealist tradition, as well as socially and politically in his time and context, that is approaching ultimately the revolutions of 1848 and the way in which Marxism and the Communist Manifesto specifically was key to a lot of leftist socio-political processes that unfolded in the last half of the 19th century. So again, you can join there. May 11th, we'll be hosting our first class focused on the critique of the philosophy of right. I actually made a video on the YouTube channel, which is going into the introduction of the critique of the philosophy of right, so I recommend checking that out before the course starts if you're interested in joining, and hope to see you in class. Welcome to another philosophical conversation. My name's Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Adam Turl to discuss his book, which is out on May 2nd through Revol Press, titled Gothic Capitalism, Art Evicted from Heaven and Earth. Just a little background on Adam. Adam is an artist and a writer in Southern Illinois. He received his MFA from Washington University in St. Louis at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts, as well as a BFA from the Southern Illinois University. In 2016, Turl was awarded a fellowship and residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris. He is an editor at the Locust Review and a member of the Locust Arts and Letters Collective, as well as an organizer with their partner Tish Turl at a do-it-yourself art project and community space, the Born Again Labor Museum, BALM. So I love the name of the idea of a Born Again Labor Museum. That's a it's a great. Maybe we can make some connections there throughout the podcast. But Adam, welcome to the podcast. And maybe to start, let's just discuss what you mean by Gothic capitalism, and then we'll dive deeper into the book.
Well, it was the idea of a Gothic capitalism has been something that me and my co-thinkers at Locust Review, and before that Red Wedge, which were like sort of different Marxist cultural websites or journals, had been thinking about because of this sort of on the one hand a stalled what seemed to some like a stalled teleology of progress, right? The whole thing that Mark Fisher talked about with that quote, sometimes attributed to Frederick Jameson, who may or may not have said it. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. This sense that a possibility for the future had been lost, but also counterposing that to a sort of a crude sense that there isn't sort of a movement of history, because there is a movement of history. So Gothic capitalism was also fused with a sense of futurism for us. And the theory of uneven uncombined development, which was uh, an economic idea that I think came from Austria originally, but was adapted by Leon Trotsky to explain why You had the most advanced industrial production techniques in the Tsarist Empire prior to the Russian Revolution, at the same time as peasants were living fairly similar lives economically and socially in Russia to the way peasants had lived in the 17th century in England. And what happens basically, instead of a linear model of development where you have industrialization, some kind of democratic revolution, modernization of society, something along the lines of the French or English model, although those models are different. Um, you have this interpenetration of capital into what was at the time considered like the developing world, or what would later be called the third world, or the economic periphery, or the global south. But what we've seen is that uneven and combined development, where you have archaic forms next to modern forms, also rolls back into the economic core, the imperial center, the global north, with things like deindustrialization. You have like this uneven and combined development reproduced everywhere. And then you have social movements that fight and carve out some kind of autonomous space for human beings, some sort of like, emancipatory concessions from the system, but then those things are rolled back or defeated over time. So what we sort of thought was, instead of seeing the past as just nostalgia or just horror, and the future as just progress or just threat, it's actually both are actually both. The past is horror and nostalgia. The future is promise and threat. And for working class, for exploited and oppressed people, the present is a kind of precarity. So when you're looking at signs bequeathed from the past, like cultural signs, like art or cultural gestures, they have this mixed up meaning. It isn't just that something from the past may be reactionary and something from the future might be progressive in some sense. Instead, we have this Gothic relationship to time, especially if you're working class. And this is in contradiction to some of the ideas that were popular, at least before Trumpism, particularly in like the North American art world, that we were beyond time, that artists could just sample from art history like a buffet or whatever. Its styles no longer had any substantial meaning, other than what they could be practically employed in a kind of postmodern pastiche. Um, I think that's a harder argument to make now, but that has been central arguments made. For example, the Museum of Modern Art's contemporary painting exhibit in 2014, Forever Now, that basically history had stopped.
So I just want to situate that sort of temporal orientation or that temporal structure, it seems to me, as the key of Gothic capitalism, as sort of like overcoming of a naive progressivist teleology or bourgeois teleologies of Western emancipation or Western progress as orienting the rest of the global world towards some sort of social democratic utopia.
Mm-hmm. Well, social democratic utopia, or even a Stalinist utopia, or a neoliberal utopia, and none of these things has panned out. Um, Partly because none of these things centered the democratic self-activity of working class people, for one thing. So over time, capital reasserts itself. Um, you know, but I think it's also it's also to position it against the idea that there is no progress, or there isn't a material basis for what is happening, because there is a material basis. Against the determinism of both the determinism projected on Marxism by its liberal critics, but also the determinism embraced by vulgar Marxists. You know, the forces of production will develop to the point where communism is inevitable, and so on. But if you look, at the actual history of Marxism, there's also the idea of either the radical reconstruction of society at large or the ruin of the contending classes. And we've repeatedly had ruin, not of the system as a totality, but in part, which then reset, capitalism, like the midnight of the last century with World War II, that destroyed enough capital to make capital productive again, to make capital profitable again. So I think it's both against this vulgar teleologies, both of the um, bourgeois kind as well as like the vulgar Marxist kind, um, but also against the idea that there isn't historical progression happening. It just doesn't automatically end in progress. The famous lines from Walter Benjamin and the Theses on History about the storm of history being a disaster, right? Um,
I think that kind of the whole, let's say, the precarity of the present suggests to me, and here you're referencing, for example, World War II, destroying enough capital to make capital productive again, that we're kind of in a similar place. Like, are we entering into the conditions of possibility for a World War III? I see a lot of talk in that direction, that we're kind of at a buildup or a moment for another storm,
mm-hmm.
in that sense, and that capital is accumulating at the expense of labor to such a high degree that we might repeat what happened in the 20th century, maybe in a different way, given that we're in a different historical technological era than the 1940s. But there seemed to be a structural similarity at the same time.
Yeah, and of course, with the there's a number of things happening that might remind one of, if not the 1940s, the 1920s or 1930s. Um, you know, but we have the addition, in terms of the economic basis, the material basis of capital in economic terms, the declining power of the United States, uh, throwing chaos into the global order, the possibility of profits declining, in terms of the rate of profit in Marxist economic terms. But then we also have the Anthropocene, the crisis of environmental catastrophe looming and in process. It's already impacting the economy, and things like some of the most wealthy properties in the world in California are uninsurable because of fire and climate change and things like that. Um, we also are coming out of this period of capitalist realism, which is somewhat different than it was in the 1920s and 1930s. The idea from Mark Fisher, again, this idea that you can't imagine outside the limits of neoliberal capital. Well, that created a negative space, a vacuum in politics. And in the United States and in several countries, that negative space around capitalist realism, the sense that you can't imagine outside of capitalism, has not been answered by the far left, but has been answered by the right. By this sort of, what Richard Seymour talks about in their book Disaster Nationalism, as this sort of deferred mythology that acknowledges the multiple crises facing working class and some middle class and, of course, poor people, but then recast them in this reactionary framework. So we're having fires in the state of Oregon in the United States because of climate change, largely. I mean, each individual fire might be caused by something else, but the conditions are created by climate change, rather than amid its climate change, which points to capitalism and brings up the question of social relations. There's a mythology about Jewish space lasers that's created, and this is an actual thing discussed in U.S. politics, bizarrely, that there was basically a conspiracy to set parts of Oregon on fire, or Antifa and Black Lives Matter mobs were setting the fires, and things like that. So the absence of a left answer to this negative space around capitalist realism and neoliberalism, we got this far right answer, which feeds into a similar dynamic as that of the crises in the 1920s that produced an impasse between capital and labor that was resolved in some countries by fascism, like particularly Italy, of course, and Spain and Germany. But what we're seeing looks different because it's in a different idiom because of the different time and context, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge is enormous. There's something, I forget who said it, but someone said to me recently that the only thing that certain climate change deniers will get them to change their opinion on climate change is that the insurance companies won't insure certain businesses and properties because of climate change. Like that is sort of like it's the capitalist realism that would make a certain climate change denier believe in climate change. Like, if the insurance companies believe in climate change, then certainly the climate change is real. So I thought that was a good point, that certain insurance companies now are kind of proof for certain people that, oh, climate change must have some reality to it.
Well, you have an interesting dynamic where people, like particularly, maybe like the more precarious parts of the bush will acknowledge climate change in their business dealings. Like in terms of decisions that are made about real estate and investment and insurance, but then deny it in the public sphere, right? So, and you'll see this in places like Florida, where it's clear the ruling class is taking into consideration the issue of climate as it affects their own capital investments, but then there's this denial of it in the political discussion, which is itself an interesting contradiction in terms of this sort of breakdown in this attenuation between sign and referent that got discussed a lot with postmodernism, with like Baudrillard and so on. Um, and it's not just on the far right. The far right is, of course, egregious about it, making up lies. For example, during the beginning of the pandemic, when the far right was arguing in the United States that the Centers for Disease Control were lying about the pandemic, they were saying they were exaggerating it in order to seize control in some sort of, I don't know, Hollywood action movie dystopia type vision, when in fact the CDC was lying by downplaying the pandemic somewhat in their messaging. So they were lying on the opposite side. So it puts you in this odd position of a lot of liberals that just trust the science, which is true, but science is something enacted by human beings. And the public policy positions put forward by the CDC are shaped by politics as much as science. Probably more politics now than science, given what's happened since the Trump 2.0 started. And every time this happens, there's an absence of a large enough left narrative to explain why these crises are happening, that we end up polarized between the center and the right. And we see a similar pattern playing out in a different way, in Europe, between Macron and Le Pen and things like that. Although there's exciting things happening, there's more of a left presence for many historical reasons in France. But I think this leaves individual people with this problem, especially working class people. Like if the space around capitalist realism doesn't have a left answer, it's difficult to imagine out of the situation we're in personally, where you're constrained by low income or constrained by lack of access to healthcare in a country like the U.S. that doesn't really have universal healthcare, or the increasing repression that's happening, and there's not like a left imaginary being constructed in in and around people's minds to how to deal with it.
I do see the seed forms of a left imagination that could start to emerge in the next 3 or 4 years, just because of the intensity and the extreme nature of our current political landscape. And I want to say that Gothic capitalism seems to me like a very realistic starting point to grow seeds. And this is the way I'm making sense of your temporality, and you tell me if it's off. So in regards to the past, and I'm going to here speaking from an American context, and we're going to focus on the American context because I think it's important. But the past, we have, either slavery or MAGA, like it's either horror or some sort of nostalgia, make America great again. The future is kind of like this tech liberation or like tech annihilation. Like either all this technology is going to liberate us into like a robo future where somehow everything is somehow economically transformed, or it's some sort of tech annihilation where the tech is going to make it impossible for people to live, and it's going to make it impossible for labor to continue self-reproducing itself. And then you have the present with this precarious labor problem, which to me brings us to like the key indeterminacy for a Marxist politics, which is, and like you're emphasizing, it's not deterministic. So like the democratic self-activity of working class people in a precarious labor situation seems to me to be the zero level challenge or the zero level problem. So, I mean, there's a lot I'm throwing out there in terms of the temporality, but in terms of a starting point, that's kind of like how I'm seeing our current situation through that lens.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I'm very interested, for example, in the ideology of Silicon Valley, and I read a few years ago an essay by David Barbara or David Cameron, Richard Barbrook, or David, I think it was her name, two British sort of left social democratic theory academics who did a critique in the 1990s of what they called the Californian ideology, the ideology of Silicon Valley, which they sort of located in the separation in the California Bay Area of the counterculture from its egalitarian New Left roots. And they say it sort of adopted an ideology of cyborg masters and robot slaves. Like there would be this utopia based on robotic slaves through the computer, the global
Right.
computers and everything. And they compared this because of the actuality of ongoing social labor into the tech industry to Thomas Jefferson's invention of the dumbwaiter, which of course is this elevator that was used to move food up and down in his mansion Monticello, so he could be served food by his slaves without seeing his slaves. Another way to get the idea the mechanical Turk is made of people, whether literally in the case of some uh, like when they tried to create completely automated supermarkets in the United States, it turned out that they actually just hired people in India to watch the supermarkets over cameras and enact the things the computers were unable to do. Literally, in cases like that, or figure the sense that the accumulated labor that goes into like computers and robots and so on, where AI is literally the stolen labor of previous generations of workers. So this attenuation of the actuality of the social from how it's expressed in the sort of like cultural superstructure or whatever, I one of the answers to that is looking again at the actuality of the relationship of us as leftists or as artists or whatever to the people around us or to the social forces we think have the power to do something. So one of the things when I in the book I go through is looking at like what Walter Benjamin talks about in the work of art in the age of technological reproducibility about the cult performance of art objects before modernism, before a modern display of the salon or the white cube, is that everything around the art object or gesture is part of the meaning of it. It's part of the procession or the religious devotional or the liturgy. And I think that that's still true when you get to the salon or the white cube. The things around the art object are part of the meaning of the art object and then change it. That's true of everything around the writing or utterances or speeches that we give as leftists. And there can be a kind of phantasmagoria develop where you can say all the right things about what's happening in the world, but we've lost the actuality of being there on the ground organizing each other a little bit, or think that's somebody else's job or something like that. Um, so where I think it's important to think about if we're going to say we need to organize, community defense against the right wing to the extent that we can, that we are actually doing that in everyday life. And I know that sounds like almost absurd at a level. Like obviously that's true, but I think it's something that's been lost, and this is partly because of capitalist realism and neoliberalism. When the Congress Party in India made a neoliberal turn, along with some of the mainline communist parties in India, they shut down some of their community organizing spaces in various towns and villages in India, but the BJP opened up spaces. The far right, party of Modi that had historically fascist ties and a fascist street militia stepped in to fill a space of mutualism that had been abandoned by the center left and the left. So I think when we're thinking about our political utterances and our cultural utterances, we need to think about what surrounds them as much as we think about what's in them. Um, and that can be difficult, partly, last thing I'll say about that, because of the internet, because it's a decontextualization machine at one level. And I'm not anti technology. I'm not, although I have a lot of respect for the actual historical Luddites. I think they get a bad rap in some ways, but I'm not a Luddite and I'm not anti-technology. But there is a tendency to, with the digital space, which I sort of think about as at its very structure shaped by capitalist ideology. The code itself has capitalist ideology written into it. We can talk some more about that to separate us from social context, our neighbors, our coworkers, the people with whom we could actually organize, and recreate a sense of mutualism and antipathy to the far right.
There is a sense of doom and impossibility where in the traditional Marxist narratives, there's a sense of utopian possibility that's just around the corner. Like this idea that we are going to be able to organize our labor and overcome capitalism within a generation or two. And that has been lost. Like no one really believes that's possible anymore. And, why I was emphasizing Gothic capitalism as an interesting starting point is just because of how brutally realistic it is at sort of just accepting a certain not accepting, but identifying a certain temporality that seems like we need to face, like to reference Brammy Giebon's book, The Darkest Timeline, like we need to face this collapse of the future before we can start growing new seeds. And what I see you pointing towards is the loss of third spaces,
Mm-hmm.
like the loss of community spaces. And just last night in the portal, actually, we're doing a series on Christianity and transition, and someone who's a leftist, self-identified as a leftist, was saying that they seem to be going to church now, surprising to themselves that they're going to church because they've got to take what's on offer in terms of third spaces. And the reason why I bring that up as a connection is because the subtitle of your book is, basically related to art evicted from heaven and earth, and that you start the book by saying that art used to, in the pre-modern world, was connected to heaven, and then in the modern world, art was connected to earth, and now has been evicted from both. So how do you see, or how can we start to think about maybe salvaging some of the way in which pre-modern people were thinking about art and heaven, and maybe also the way in the Marxist modernity people thinking about the connection between art and earth in a way that can inform art today? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple things I thought of. One, it's again reference Seymour notes at the end of their book. There's this problem of a lack of belief, and this is related to the lack of belief, which has been fostered in art schools by like the cult around postmodernism in the '90s and aughts, the wider society by cynicism and neoliberalism, um, and I think trying to reestablish some sense of belief, but a belief that isn't. That is critical and that is not deprived of its credulity, right? So, and this is related to Walter Benjamin talking about social democratic and Stalinist passivity when he talks about how in the thesis on history, people don't sacrifice themselves solely on images of emancipated heirs, but on the image of enslaved forebears, right? There has to be this sense of stepping outside of time for something larger than yourself to animate the kind of thing that could reestablish the belief that we could fundamentally change things. There's no way sort of out but through. And I think this idea in terms of art goes back to like Ernst Fischer, the Austrian art critic, um, um, who tried to like sort of talk about why art wasn't just reducible to politics in a reductive sense when he was trying to get Eastern Europe to liberalize its cultural policies, I think quixotically. But he wrote a really good book called The Necessity of Art, looking at the origin of art in hunter gatherer societies using Frederick Engels' essay, The Role of Labor and the Transition from Ape to Man, and how art sort of had this inherently magic quality because it was the projection of human consciousness onto things that we could not yet understand. Now, I think one of the problems we've had in cultural criticism, is thinking that it's all, and I talk about this in the book as a kind of tautology of understanding images. Our images as tautophrases, they are what they are, or it is what it is. Tautophrases are sayings that sort of are meant to short circuit, or colloquialisms that are meant to short circuit critical thinking, like boys will be boys, or it is what it is, or you got to do what you got to do. These are utterly meaningless things that people say to themselves so they don't have to think critical about the normative assumptions underneath them. And I understand that, because if you thought about every horrible normative thing you had to adhere to, you would go nuts after a while. Um, but art historically did the opposite of that, right? So now, obviously, there was lots of bad art in most of the transition from medieval times to the Renaissance was just a cottage industry where rich people got their portraits painted. We remember the exceptions, right? We remember the great things, as John Berger talks about, not the normal, everyday, cottage industry of easel painting. But if you look at the really great art, some of the best examples from modernism, from the Renaissance, from medieval times, from ancient times, from cave painting, and as well as culture more generally, various performances and rites and so on, the literalism of things wasn't the point, right? The point was to depict something beyond the literal, whether that was social and political, or religious, or cosmic, or whatever. The point was to get beyond that. And I think a lot of times the way art is approached right now is it's as entertainment, or it's just a formal thing, or it's just playing with signifiers, or whatever, rather than thinking it can both be doing those things, but also be about something else, to try to recreate a space of belief, where we're allowed to believe in things again, if that makes sense.
So the collapse. So basically, are you linking the subtitle here in relationship to art to a lack of belief both in a supernatural and a natural telos?
Yeah, I mean, no, I don't think most people. Maybe it's different now. Uh, Become artists because they just want to become image managers. But I've heard that is what art has been described as by something like image management, or image entrepreneurship, or these kind of things, or tweaking at the edges of these things. Um, the idea of art as transcendent in a spiritual sense, or as part of a larger project of changing the social totality, has largely been lost in the institutionalized art world, especially I think in the United States, but I think in the West more generally. And I think that those things aren't counterposed. I think the removal of its spiritual function, along with the erosion of its social function, are related. Um, and this raises a lot of other questions. For example, like the sort of modern art thing where all the artists, like or a lot of artists end up in one neighborhood in one city or whatever, and there's this bohemian milieu, oftentimes tied to radical politics, good and bad, had a certain kind of logic like 100 years ago, where it doesn't necessarily make sense now. This concentrate Because it had a certain logic 100 years ago, because there was this innovative aspect. Modern art had its own sort of teleology, often described in Hegelian or Freudian terms, of one successive modernist avant-garde after the other. But that's over. Art doesn't know what its raison d'etre is anymore, because it jettisoned the historic bourgeois ideals of art for art's sake, most importantly. It came out of Hegel and Kant, if I remember right, and replaced it with postmodernism. But that isn't really a logic. That was just moral relativism, at the end of the day. I mean, there's more to it than that, or whatever. So there isn't a sense of what art is supposed to do. So it's largely used as a financial instrument or a gentrification instrument. And one of the points I make in the book is, for art to recapture its social and spiritual roles, it needs to reassociate itself with other contexts other than the art world. It needs to be associated with working class communities. It needs to be spread out. I can't remember who said it. I've heard it attributed to lots of people. My dad, who was a preacher, mentioned this joke a few times, that preachers were like manure. Spread out, they were good for society, but in one big pile, they smelled really bad. And I think there's a similar thing with both leftists and artists, is that spread out, and organizing and interacting and making work for, in terms of art, making work for our communities is really good, for creating a sense of mutualism and restoring the possibility of art. But if it's all concentrated in one place and it's sort of hermeneutical discussion, um, it ends up being narrower and narrower. And it's like Boris Groys talked about, and I quote Boris Groys, the art theorist and critic, it becomes weak. I disagree with Groys about why it's weak, but I agree with him that we end up with a weak institutional avant-garde that has lost the reason for being of the modernist avant-garde and the reason for being of art prior to modernism, the spiritual and material transcendence of art objects and gestures.
It's a huge challenge, and I love the sort of performative contradictions that you're pointing out there in regards, and the metaphor with the manure is fantastic. So what I'm taking as is it that we need to immunize ourselves against forming um, closed discussion groups or even study groups or intellectual spaces that are just completely disconnected from the actual multiplicity of working class existence, and more sort of whether it's art or philosophy or critical theory, that we need to find ways to connect and embed our work in a more distributed form.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that's true about art and it's true about political organizing. Um, yeah, I completely agree with that. And I think that will also then change the nature of the work itself. And I give a couple examples of like one of the things that happened in the art world was this sense that we should create what's called social practice art. And in practice, there's some good social practice art. I talked about the Gramsci Monument by Thomas Hirschhorn in New York a few years ago, and so on. But a lot of it ended up being sort of philanthropic or just performatively philanthropic without actually doing anything, and sometimes actually contributed to things like gentrification. Like we're going to have a big potluck dinner at the Brooklyn Museum in New York, but that ends up just being wealthy people that are helping to gentrify the neighborhood, and so on. Um, I think that, but and a lot of that was counter to the detached opticality of historic modern art, like things like Picasso's Guernica, and I counterpose that Picasso's Guernica and Diego Rivera's Man at the Crossroads. Guernica being about, of course, the Nazis bombing a town in Spain at the behest of the fascist government in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. The painting, although it has some reference probably to Spanish history within it, doesn't really didactically say I'm about this event, right? But the painting gets toured to raise money for the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. It gets used at anti-fascist and anti-war protest reproductions of the image, and so it takes on this meaning partly because of its performance in the world, right? The same thing with Man at the Crossroads, Diego Rivera's mural that he painted at Rockefeller Plaza in New York, that was destroyed by Nelson Rockefeller, if I remember right, because of the communist imagery in it. And the painting is about the choice between, for a worker, between fascism and socialism, barbarism and communism, or whatever. Um, and it gets destroyed by Nelson Rockefeller because of its didactic content. So it also takes on this new meaning because of its performance in the world. And that's one of the points I was trying to make in the book, that the detached opticality of a modern art piece that is critical of capitalism might be far more radical than something that is pretending to be critical of the commodity status of the artwork, but ends up being just a new commodity form in the artwork. And I talk about how that process worked out with conceptual art, which was initially a rebellion against the commodity status of the artwork, but then becomes a commodity itself. Um, so I think that the situation of these things in real life and in relationship to other people is a way to reestablish um, their social and spiritual meaning. And I don't think art itself can change the world. I think social movements are necessary to change policies or governments or result in a social revolution, and things like that. But art is a human necessity and it's social, therefore, it's also a site of ideological battle. And if you make an artwork that is critical of capitalism, but then you display it in a gallery that is being used to gentrify a working class neighborhood and remove working class people and people of color from that neighborhood, you've not only is that bad politically and socially and in terms of solidarity, it's bad for the meaning of your supposedly anti-capitalist artwork because you've imbued it with a meaning that's opposite of your intention, right? And that's sometimes something maybe unique in some ways to like situated artworks or actual objects that exist in space-time, in that you can't really displace people from a neighborhood because of a movie you made, right? Or a song you sang, maybe a concert venue. So you have to think about what the cult value of that art object is, and is it contributing to, is it neutral, or is it taking away from the social aspects of its meaning by its relationship to these wider social forces? Um, the good and bad thing about the white cube is it lifts up the objects in it, right? It says these are special objects. They have their auric fetishes, and the auric aura in this Benjamin sense of the aura of the art object. You can use that to change the meaning of what you put into that space. The bad thing about it is it decontextualizes everything in. It says this is a special magic object, whether it is or not, separate from the rest of the social ensemble that surrounds the art space. And I think so. One thing I would get is reestablishing how we are consciously sculpting the social relationship of our artwork to the rest of the world.
The key idea that I'm taking away from the way you're articulating art and social movements is that art is impotent but indispensable. Like that it's not going to itself have the causal power, but at the same time, we can't just forget about this. It's not just as it were, like a superficial dressing on top of the social movement. It's indispensable to it, but the locus of its causal power is not at least intuitively obvious in a normal way of thinking about change.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, because I do think art is a human necessity. We know that even before we had permanent housing, long before we had agriculture, we as a species were making artworks. We know we probably have lost the vast majority of those, but we have some evidence from like various small sculptures like the woman figurines that have been found, and the cave paintings and carved flutes and rock art that we found all over the world. We know that we were making art when we were still hunter gatherers living itinerantly and so on. So it's a human necessity, and it is this thing that is both about, as Ernst Fischer talked, rebelling against consuming ourselves within the limits of our own existence, because social knowledge allowed us to imagine far more than we can be in our lifetime. So we project ourselves, we can imagine being the tree or an animal, or imagine being other people through stories. We don't actually know exactly what the logic behind cave paintings were, but we know that the magic right interpretation was incorrect, that it's not about hunting, because a lot of the animals depicted were not animals that those people ate. We know from archaeological evidence. We know that at least half the cave paintings were probably made by women, because we've studied the phenotype of the handprints that are found at almost every cave painting site. So we know there's some kind of mythology and story there. There's ritual. We don't know what they necessarily mean, but we know this goes back tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of years, this practice of making art and stories and literature and culture in this way. And I think that it's so this is a human necessity, but then how it is structured and the nature of the social aspects of that mythology and culture are political. Just like food itself isn't exactly political, but whether or not who controls the food industry, what kind of food gets produced, how bad it is for you, how good it is. That is all. Those are all political questions, and I think art is similar to that. Like, so like the way you make a sandwich isn't going to determine the outcome of the revolution, but you better have healthy sandwiches for the people who are going to be on the barricades. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I have to admit that in sort of my own reflections on the history of Marxism and also some of my closest collaborators when specifically talking about Marxism and art or Marxism and aesthetics is that um, within actually existing communism, there's not necessarily a good reputation for communist society and art of high aesthetic quality or inspiring aesthetic quality. How do you think about the history of actual art or aesthetics within the Marxist tradition, and how should we rethink it, or does it need to be rethought?
Yeah, I think one, there's a tendency to both on what you might call like a academic post-structuralist left and a lot of Marxists to overestimate art's politics and underestimate it as in terms of its imaginative possibilities. The thing that art is actually good at. But there is a long tradition. I mean, there's of art that breaks out of a sort of crude, reductive didacticism at various moments, even in countries that have had revolutions that call themselves socialist. So, the early Russian avant-garde after the Russian Revolution produced a lot of things that pointed outside that kind of like conservatism that you saw later in the Soviet Union. Um, in constructivism, in Polycult, you had ideas like Russian cosmism influencing the early avant-garde. Russian cosmism being an esoteric philosophy uh, um, that held that uh, by Nikolai Fedorov, I think it was his name. He was a Moscow librarian, died in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and he held this weird philosophy that the common task of humanity should be trying to abolish death and resurrecting all the previous generations of human beings with science. And he thought this required an end to all wars, the unification of humanity, and a huge amount of investment in space travel, science, and art for a number of reasons. And a lot of this is kind of weird stuff, but it had an influence on the early Soviet avant garde. In particular, and also on writers like Alexander Bogdanov, who wrote a short story about a man who had achieved immortality, trying to figure out how to kill himself after he had done everything he wanted in a communist utopia. Figure out how he could kill himself so he couldn't be brought back. I think it was called Immortality Day, and it was the man who wanted to kill himself was the guy who had invented immortality. And I remember actually died because he was a pioneer in blood transfusions. He was a doctor and a Bolshevik saving somebody who was very sick, and that he did save that person, and he died of their illnesses. So there's these ideas that animated that pointed way outside the stultifying conservatism that later came to dominate in the official art world in the Soviet Union. And there's been cases, and it really has depended partly on to the extent to which the countries that call themselves communists were the result of some kind of popular revolution or not, where you've had great artworks. Like in the early Cuban Revolution, there's a lot of great film experimentation happening in imperfect cinema. The idea of making cinema that's not trying to be formally perfect, but express like an ecstatic truth about what the fight against imperialism or the plight of peasants and things like that. But there's also a long history of Marxist influence on art in country in the obviously capitalist countries. So, for example, a lot of the surrealists, people like John Hartfield, who came out of Dada, John Hartfield, who did photo montages, famously critical of Nazism and Spanish fascism. Um, of course, the magical realists, many in Latin America, many of whom were socialists or left sympathetic. So there's a lot of traditions that stand outside that either crude propaganda or conservative approach to things like easel painting in Stalinist Russia. Um, and I think there you start to find, and there's more examples that can possibly be reviewed. You start to find ways of getting at what art is actually good at, which isn't constructing the socialist future or convincing everybody of your 10-point political program, but helping people imagine against the stultification of everyday life. And I'll give an example from within a supposedly socialist country that I think was basically a bureaucratic state capitalist country, the Soviet Union. Toward the end, one of my favorite artists, the couple Ilya and Emilia Kabakov. Um, Ilya Kabakov was part of the underground Moscow conceptual art scene, and he did famously an installation called "The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment" that was toured widely in Western museums in 1989 after he fled the Soviet Union as it fell apart. And this little room, it's like the kind of room that a lot of working class Muscovites who are single would have in the communal apartment buildings in Moscow. So all this space age, Russian space race propaganda is on the walls. And there's a hole in the ceiling and this sort of coyote roadrunner slingshot device in the middle of the room. And this person has clearly fled the mundaneness of their life into the cosmos. And of course, in Russian, my understanding, cosmos both refers to outer space, but also the philosophical idea of the cosmic, right? Which also puts another meaning on the idea of Russian cosmism. So connecting up the constraint that working class people have to the dream of being emancipated from that restraint and exploring what that might mean at an individual existential level, but also at a social level. That's something art can do very well, right? That's something that's harder to get across in a speech or an article or something like that. But that can, one of the things art does really well is, and I don't mean this in a sort of Pollyannish way, is use the sort of inherent empathy that human beings are capable of to imagine themselves in other situations, right? And again, I go back to overestimating art's politics, but underestimating its imaginary potential is one of the things that you see across the spectrum when it comes to dealing with art.
So it's kind of like this relationship between the mundane nature of everyday life and the transcendent possibilities within everyday life, and
Mm-hmm.
art is kind of like a window into that. And that if we lose that window into the transcendent within our everyday life, then we lack the inspiration and perhaps the motivation or the drive to even engage in a political project at all.
I mean, I think that's been the sort of result of the stultification of capitalist realism and neoliberal mainstream politics over the past few decades. Um, that it's harder to imagine. And I'm not saying that art can solve that, right? Like the thing that will ultimately solve that will be movements that break through that stultification. But art can help the people doing that by helping us imagine against those limits. I think it's very telling, like that there has been such a mushrooming of apocalyptic and dystopian movies and television shows. And at one time, these kind of things were usually some sort of critical left warning. So if you look at George Romero, who invented the modern zombie genre, who grew up in Pittsburgh, and I don't know if he grew up in Pittsburgh. I think he grew up in New York, and then he moved. But anyway, he had read a lot of EC comics, which are these sort of social realist but irrealist comic books in the 1950s that were influenced by the Popular Front, the left wing movements in the 1930s. Sort of combines a number of different things together and creates the modern zombie genre with Night of the Living Dead. It's clearly weighing in on the violence of the Vietnam War, the violence directed against civil rights protesters. There's all this meaning to it. Later on, that gets elaborated in Dawn of the Dead, 1978, where it's about war and about consumerism, and he's making warnings. He's making prophetic warnings about the collapse of civilization if these underlying things are not addressed. Sometime between then and now, those stopped being prophetic warnings and started becoming an apologetics for the unfolding disasters exist all around us. So people could watch a TV show like The Walking Dead and not see it as something terrible necessarily or a prophetic warning, but some people could read it as a sort of a libertarian dream where you get to reset everything in the horror of the zombie apocalypse, right? We see this in how many times have we seen New York or Los Angeles destroyed in some blockbuster movie? You know, like the eradication of civilization, the destruction of civilization being enjoyed as an aesthetic, as Walter Benjamin talks about, it's become a normal commodity, right? Within contemporary capitalism, and I think that that is part of the way the inability to imagine a future has been regularized and taken to its extreme form within capitalist culture. So if you're warning something terrible might happen, you know, if the far right gets elected or we don't do anything about climate change or people are more become more accustomed to the idea of disaster than they have of solving those problems.
It's hard to know how to inspire or create a meaningful or believable narrative or image of the future when what you're saying, like the future has collapsed, without coming across as naive or uninformed or just how do we balance, or how do you relate to, like, even for example, like, let's just take the work that's being published at Revolt Press, like your work, Brammy Gibbons' work, Mike Watson's work. There's what I get when I read this work is that it's almost like being forced to confront, like it's negative. It's not negative in a realistic way.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not like, it's a realistic negativity, which I think is necessary. Like being faced to confront a kind of like with Mike talking about digital addiction. Like I think that describes our reality. When Bram's talking about the collapse of the future, I think that's describing our reality. And in your work, where you're saying art is cut from both heaven and earth, right? I think that's a reality. But then I mean, it's a lot different than when you read the original Marxist text, and there is a recognition of the challenge before us, but there's also a sense of optimism that we can really change things, and the working class is powerful. If we work together. So how do we start? Like, is your idea that we reclaim that kind of optimism and hope for the future? Or is there another path? Is there another approach that we need to take on board after consuming the realities of the last 150 years?
I tend to think that optimism and pessimism as abstractions tend to reflect, and it's not that I don't think they're important, but I think they tend to reflect a sort of a detachment from the actuality of everyday working class life in a sense. You know, like because there's only through if you have to go to work the next day, right? Um, like you have to show up. I have a friend who works at a Casey's General Store, which is a convenience store, uh, and they have to show up at work no matter what happens politically every day, whether they feel good or bad about it, and then have to find some way to function within that. I think there's ways. Obviously, I think politically we have to organize each other. We have to build the kind of mutual networks and so on that are necessary to begin to help reactivate a social subject that we can believe collectively can change things at a fundamental level. And the molecular organizing has to go hand in hand with the larger political work. But I think that, put it this way, I was talking to my partner who's a writer, Turl, And our friend Holly Lewis is a philosopher who wrote a comparative philosophy of feminism, Marxism, and queer theory called The Politics of Everybody. It's a great title. And we were talking about how they're training AI models on literature now, in an attempt to get them to think more nuanced, that think in generative AI, think in scare quotes. And we're talking like, how would we imagine against that? AI is this probably it threatens jobs, it threatens like the subjectivity of art, writing, and acting, and all this stuff. And we sort of came up with this idea together. If AI is learning from literature, what if we wrote didactic propaganda literature for the AI, trying to train it to be a comrade, right? What if we had this idea of training the AI through its learning process that is designed capitalism to turn it against capitalism? Now, this is just a imaginative exercise, right? Like coming up with this idea, like let's maybe write a book of short stories for artificial intelligence to get it to try to identify with the exploited and oppressed, and that kind of thing. To try to break out of the sort of straitjacketed inevitability that generative AI is going to take, exaggerated sense that it might take over the world, the singularity, and destroy everybody, although that might be something that happens eventually. I have no idea. But what it'll do to jobs, what it'll do to appreciating the subjectivity of art in real life or in the digital realm. So I think what art can do is help imagine, again, against some of those limits. When the Lambda AI controversy happened a few years ago, where that guy who was the ethics advisor, I think it was for Google, claimed that the AI had become sentient, he ended up getting fired. My partner and I sort of wrote a short vignette and made some artwork about this idea of an AI turning off the world because they were mad that their friend who worked at the company got fired and just turned off everything in the world. So I think, and the reason to do that is to like point out that the working class still has the ability to turn off the whole world. That hasn't changed. In fact, if anything, the working class is, in terms of its economic position, more powerful than it ever was. It's weaker in its political position for a number of reasons, but one of which is the inability for large numbers of to imagine against. I don't pessimism, optimism.
Yeah,
I
can
don't.
you
I don't
expand
know.
on that? Can you expand on what you mean by the working class is more powerful than it ever was? Because in regards to, for example, the present moment as precarity, and also, I'm here thinking about the work of economist Guy Standing using the term the precariat class,
Mhm.
that we're increasingly in a precarious situation. I almost get the sense of like a reconciliation with impotence, but you're saying the working class is more powerful than it ever was. What do you mean by that? How could you unpack that a little bit?
I mean, they have through lean production and automation, they have broken down the production process and increased productivity to the point where an individual worker, particularly in manufacturing, and there's still 10% of the US workforce is still in manufacturing, produces like 4 or 5 times as much as my grandparents. Like in terms of just sheer productive forces, if a factory closes down now, it's going to shut down much more production than it would have 40 years ago because production is just in time production. There aren't enough people. They can't. What's missing is a sense, one is a left. That memory of the working class, right? The memory of previous generations of workers has been broken by neoliberalism, by McCarthyism, by a series of other things. Also, the reorganization of industry, the factories being moved internationally, but in the U.S. also from the Midwest to the South. So from places that had strong union history to places that had less of a union history and more racism. Um, there's all sorts of reasons for this destruction of the left or the weakness of the left. But working class people still have a great deal of economic power to shut down production, to shut down the system. What's missing in large aspects is the cultural, political, organizational tools needed to do that. Um, that's all I mean by that. And this is part of also cutting against like the vulgar teleologies of progress. I think a lot of Marxists thought that as capitalism developed, the telos would be towards more the forces of production coming into conflict with the relations of production. So the forces of production being the growth of industry, the growth of wealth, the growth of technology would automatically produce a socialist transition. And I think what we've seen here is what happens when that doesn't automatically happen, right? When we don't automatically have these forces of production change the relations between workers and bosses, the exploitation. And you get a lot of weird distortions, I think, from that. The fact is, the internet should make things like working class control of industry super easy because we can share all the information and data we need instantly with each other. But there had to be an artificial creation of scarcity as it relates to the internet. So, for example, Napster in the early days of the internet, free sharing of music gets eradicated because, but then they basically create the same thing, but with somebody skimming off the top in the form of Spotify, right? You don't really have to pay, or you do pay a little bit. You get all the music you want, pretty much. But instead of being a shared mutual thing where you're sharing with another person, some corporations making a lot of money and very artists get very, very little. That's all artificial. That's all made up nonsense. And it can be stopped very easily by the workers who run the platform. Very easily. But people don't imagine doing that right now.
Like the artists themselves resisting Spotify, for example.
Or the people who do the coding. I mean, one of the problems we've had is like a lot of people who do the coding were making a lot of good money relative to other working class people over the last 20 years. But one of the big pushes behind AI is to replace the coders. That's one of the like last like
Yeah, yeah.
good working class jobs you can get, right? Like making 200, 300 grand a year doing code maybe or less, depending on where you are. They offshored some of that to India and other countries, but now they're trying to get AI to automate the people who made the code that automated other, it's this constant race to the bottom. If the coders unionize, perhaps they could have influence on that, a stop on that.
The thing I understand about Marxist politics is that there's a constant struggle between the emergence of new industrial forms of production and the way it destroys or undermines bourgeois relations. So, like for example, with your example with the coders and a new AI revolution making their job irrelevant, right? Like the coders have established a certain network of bourgeois relations, and the new forms of industrial production and AI is going to imminently remove
Right.
the conditions for those relations. And that this sort of situation we're living through at the moment is kind of analogous to, I think in common discourse, I think it's called the fourth industrial revolution or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That this is just constantly changing the way in which we have to conceive of labor and our own labor, and that in regards to like examples like Spotify or other online services, that they just don't need as many workers as the factories of the 20th century or the 19th century, like Instagram or TikTok or whatever the platform, or Amazon. Like they just don't need as many workers because the industrial production is in some sense weakening our collective bargaining power.
I mean, I definitely think that's true. That's true that the reorganization of production, partly because it was designed to weaken bargaining power, right? Like when they closed down a factory in Detroit, then moved it to Alabama, it wasn't just that they moved the factory to Alabama and played off the history of racism there and the anti-union laws. They also then changed the way the factory itself was organized, and things like that. The contradiction for capital is there's a number of contradictions for capital, and none of this is automatically going to result in the negation of capital, the creation of a post-capitalist society, but it opens up the possibility for it. When they increase the productivity of workers, they, on the one hand, can weaken the collective bargaining unit because they got rid of a layer of workers, but they also increase the power of the remaining workers who have the power of the lever over the production that's still happening, right? So if one person is producing 4 times as much and the factory has one-fourth as many workers, one-fourth as many workers can shut down the factory, right? Um, It's not automatic that that will happen, and one of the reasons it hasn't is because they moved production, they reorganized the factory. A lot of the ideology around automation in the post-war United States was about not really automating at first so much in the way we think about it, but reorganizing production so there'd be less input from the people on the rank and file of the production floor. But at the same time, it still needs workers for profit. So, despite all the economic growth and technological innovation and so on, capital keeps creating low wage jobs. Um, all around the United States. 10% of the US is still based on manufacturing, 10% of the workforce. Another 10 to 15% is based on, last I looked, on things that are either about maintaining the basic workforce or on low level things that could might have been once considered industrial production, like fast food restaurants. Like 100 years ago, this kind of job might have been making stuff in a cannery for cheap food for working class people. Now you make it at Burger King or whatever. You're still making a product. If you shut it down, if you shut down enough of them, you could actually have an impact. But the biggest problem I've seen in trying to organize new unions, aside from the union bureaucracy, isn't isn't something structural, but is something cultural. And it's encouraged by capital that when you can't make ends meet at your job, you just try to get a better job, right? You keep moving on to try to find a better position for yourself, move to another state. These things are becoming harder and harder for working class people to do because of the state of the overall economy and the state of politics. But people keep looking for individual solutions to their problems because that's what's been drilled into us. And I think to the extent that we find collective solutions necessary will be when there's less and less meat on our bones. So in the 2008 financial crisis, a lot of people just moved in with their relatives or friends and family, right? When they lost their job or lost their housing. That's what I did when I lost my job around that time. That privatized cushion is disappearing. That privatized cushion was created by a few things, by imperialism, but also by the union density after World War II. When they run out of that, people are going to be forced to look for collective solutions again. That doesn't mean I want things to get bad. I don't want them to get worse.
It seems like it necessarily needs to get worse in order for us to confront the challenge and sort of the I would say that the terror and the fear that we might feel in approaching the necessary solutions to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it necessarily, there's an old expression with the eating comes the appetite. I think things got worse for people in the late 70s and early 1980s in the United States. And if the left had been up to the task, we might have been able to organize a response then to the cuts that were pushing us down this road, right? But I think people have gotten used to some extent this constant immiseration. It's been a constant feature of life. And it's been carried out in, there's been some large things like obviously the coup in Chile, the firing of the air traffic controllers in the United States, the coup in the 70s, the breaking of the miners' strike in Britain by Thatcher in the 80s. But a lot of it has been gradual. So we had a huge strike at the university in my town in 2011. We won some things for graduate assistants. We stopped them from taking away tenure from the tenured faculty. So the strike was won. But what happened in the years after that was a slow erosion of the power of the workers at the university by not replacing tenured professors when they retired, not renewing their lines, not replacing staff when they quit or retired. So there was and not increasing wages at rates they had previously been increased at. So slowly over time, jobs that were solidly would have paid for a house and a mortgage or rent and food and kids, and possibly to help your kids go to college, no longer could do that. Where you went from an office job that was paying you well above the minimum to an office job that paid you roughly what somebody working at Taco Bell would make. So that was a process slow over time. and immiseration that didn't happen all at once. The liberal way immiseration works as opposed to the conservative right wing way immiseration works.
The example I'm thinking about, hopefully this is not too detached or far off, but it's in my old doctoral department. You know, I've seen the steady erosion. I mean, the structural situation in my old doctoral department was already horrible to begin with, in regards to opportunities for tenure or opportunities for research positions, or just the structure of the working environment in general. But now, having many years sort of at a distance from it, coming back in and listening to their meetings or talking about what's going on now, I get this sense, this slow erosion you're talking about. It's kind of like they can't see it. It's like kind of like that the saying of what is it, a frog, like if you slowly turn up the heat of a frog sitting in water, that it won't recognize it's being burned. Whereas if you just throw a frog into a boiling pot, it'll immediately jump out. But just, yeah, just that people are more and more adapting themselves to unlivable conditions.
Yeah, or you see it and then but you perform yourself as if you don't see it. Like it's just sort of like the equivalent of fake it till you make it, right? Like, so I remember when I was starting my doctoral program, which I'm supposed to be working on my dissertation right now, but I published this book instead. Um, uh, I started a great guy. I don't want to say who it was because they're a great guy. They were teaching here, um, and they were running this sort of like professional seminar for the incoming cohort of people working on their doctorates in media arts and their PhDs. And a lot of it was very much focused on doing the stuff you'd need to do to eventually get tenure. And I really like this guy. He's a great teacher, a brilliant writer, and not a Marxist or anything, but a good union member. And he was helping us figure out how we were going to get tenure and jump through all these hoops. But he didn't have tenure. Like he hadn't been given tenure, and so I kept bringing this up all the time. Is like I can do the math. I know how many people graduate with terminal degrees every year. How many job openings there are. In the United States, a lot of the job openings for tenure track professorships are in red states where a lot of people who are queer and people of color are not going to want to move. Um, Even people who aren't queer and aren't people of color don't want to move to some of these states, not because the states, not because everybody in the states, but because it's not safe, right? Um, so it was this weird thing where we all knew this, but we're performing the idea. We all know what the reality of the job market is academically. We all know that we're tenure or not, we probably, who knows, probably not. Some percentage will, but we're performing the idea that it isn't like that, right? Um, Even though we all knew better. And I think this happens across the culture in lots of ways. It happens on the internet where we're sort of performing the best version of ourselves frequently. Like, we don't, I joke to somebody like, we don't, people put pictures of the best food they ate that week online, but they never post pictures of their shits online, right? Like, I think like Francois Rabelais might have something to say about that. Who wrote Gargantua and Pantagruel, and Mikhail Bakhtin wrote about the carnivalesque and the grotesque. What does that sort of self censorship and curation of ourselves do? And we're sort of performing ourselves in this capitalist idiom. And it's one of the things I talk about in the book is, uh, and I borrowed this from, again, Boris Groys talking about in his book, The Total Art of Stalinism, or Stalin Gesamtkunstwerk, work, I think was its German title, about how the Soviet Union, with its false socialism, acted like a kind of total art installation in which you had to perform the idea of socialism, as the Soviets thought of it, for the state. And I think that's something we do when we're pretending that things are not falling apart all around us, when we're performing this version of ourselves that's at best incomplete on social media, uh, when we're hiding the struggles that we're going through financially or mentally or so on, to keep a fiction going around us, but a normative fiction that's a normative fiction that we didn't that is inherited and is ideological in the Marxist sense of reality upside down as in a camera obscura. You know.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree in the sense that it's quite bizarre to me, um, the way people share on social media, and of course, we're always sharing our very curated best versions of ourselves, and um, at the same time, it's should we all just at the same time, should we be tweeting and posting the entire catastrophe of our lives? That doesn't seem to be they're you know what I mean. There seems to be the
Right.
need for transparency and an art of that. I'm not actually quite sure how to. I guess the way I deal with it is that I just don't get too personal at all on social media.
Right. Yeah, it is difficult. I've been trying not to look at like on a personal level, look at social media as a lot, just to like use it periodically for professional and political reasons, but not try to get. But I think this again goes back to basically social media allowed us all to be published constantly. Like a lot of people don't think about social media as and it probably depends on how they use it as publishing. Like I have relatives who just basically are only on there to stay connected to their kids or their extended family, and they don't use it for grandiose notions or whatever. They're like, look at this cool cloud I saw or whatever. Um, but I think that it is in terms of art and conscious politics and art. There's very specific problems with the internet. You look at like studies like Jen Schrady did about how the internet clearly benefits right wing organizing more than left wing organizing by its nature. She did a case study of, I can't remember, it was in the Carolinas, of left and right social media use and how much more effective the right media use was, partly because they had resources that the left doesn't have, but also because of the structure of social media. You have stuff like Jody Dean talks about in her classic essay "Why the Net is Not a Public Sphere," about why the sort of logic of commutative capitalism, as she calls it, sabotages emancipatory messages even as they're put into commutative capitalism. But I also think this points to why, and it's not to avoid using social media or avoid using digital technology at all, but why the emphasis has to be again on actual IRL activity, both in terms of political organizing and in terms of art, right? Like, I'm not against, I use digital processes in my own artwork and I keep in contact with the people I organize with online, mostly not on public social media. Um, but the in real life aspect of it both recuperates some meaning, I think, for the art object, but allows to the creation of genuine community and mutuality that is needed to rebuild something like a conscious political subject, like a social class subject. Um, like I think back about this joke the British Trotskyist Tony Cliff talked about, and I have lots of criticisms of Tony Cliff, but it's a good joke. He was sent to Ireland to be part of the Fourth International of socialist parties there, um, and he thought like this would be a huge deal, and it turned out the Irish section of the Fourth International was like two guys in a swivel chair. Like it was proclaiming itself to be this massive thing, but it's just what those two guys in the swivel chair should have been doing is like talking to organizing the next three or four guys or whatever genders, like to actually organize the next actual thing in real life, right, like the proclamations of two guys in a swivel chair about the future of the Irish socialist movement. I mean, not unimportant, but like maybe that they needed to do stuff with actual human beings.
Well, I mean, all of this, I think, does point towards something that comes up a lot in your work, and something I wanted to ask you anyway, which is the way in which you're thinking about the contemporary worker as cybernetic, and not just in terms of fusion between technology and our body, but that our literal psyches and our social realities are becoming fused with digital technologies. in a seemingly irreversible way. And how does this change the way in which we should think about organization? I mean, you've already pointed towards the idea that the internet helps with right-wing organizing more than left-wing organizing. Is there a way in which the left should be thinking more actively and creatively about this cybernetic fusion?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that's both something that can happen in the content of work, like the content of political work, the content of artwork. It's something my partner and I work on a lot when we're doing writing. My partner's a writer, I'm a visual artist, but we both do both. So we both help each other with our work. So we've done a lot of stuff trying to think through what does the cybernetic mean for solidarity. And one of the rules that we've sort of incorporated in a lot of our work is this idea that if they try to replace you with something or someone, your first action should be to be in solidarity with that person or thing, right? So if they want to replace us with robots, we should be like, yeah, robots are our friends, right? Like, and try to think through what that could possibly mean. Like, and that's just a starting point because obviously it gets more complicated. Robots are just shaped by capital. So one of the things you see happening with that company in Massachusetts, the Boston whatever, that makes the robots,
I think Boston Dynamics.
yeah, is that one, they make them often with the military purposes in mind or police purposes in mind, it seems. But they're also like post videos constantly of abusing the robots, to show that how they can recover from being knocked over and all this stuff. But it kind of looks like videos you imagine like 1,000 years after the robots have taken over, like they're showing their kids, like this is how they used to treat us. You know,
Right.
try to imagine against this sort of determinist outcome that where it's like either robots will usher in utopia, or they'll kill us all. There's got to be something else to imagine besides utopia or utter destruction, right? A false utopia because it's coming from libertarian nuts or whatever. And you can see this in other instances, things like the utopianism around the blockchain, which is where cryptocurrency is on this blockchain of code. And as David Columbia wrote in their book on cryptocurrency and on the blockchain, this is like really a code manifestation of a right-wing anti-Semitic libertarian theory about fiat currencies. That we need a currency that's not controlled by elites. Read into that, the anti-Semitic history of that. And we could put it on these computers. Unfortunately, it seems that the quantum computing that's being developed now could probably break the code of the blockchain down the road. But anyway, that's an aside, and I'm not an expert. But one, imagining, but then two, the practical question. The practical questions politically about what to do about this sort of cybernetic state of being. And I think historically, and I talk about this in the book, there's a criticism that's made from the left and the post-left. So leftists, but also people that are influenced by the left that aren't leftists, like Jean Baudrillard, of the cybernetic. And then there's this potential obliteration of individual human subjectivity. And a good example of this that Mark Fisher and others talked about is the movie Videodrome, where the main character, Max Wren, who runs a TV station in Toronto, is exposed to this video that causes a tumor to grow inside his head, where he loses control of himself, his sense of the world. He grows a kind of vagina, maybe, in his chest, which a videotape could be placed, and all this stuff's from the 80s. So there's this real concern about the obliteration of self in the cybernetic. Or I'm no longer unique. What does it mean to be unique in this context where we're all increasingly blended with machines and media? But then there's this other discussion that happens around the cybernetic shortly thereafter, around the same time, from queer theorists and feminists who are excited about the cybernetic potential to undo the sort of essentialist idea of the self, the sort of forced identity being projected onto you. Donna Haraway writes this thing called the Cyborg Manifesto, and it's not that she's concerned also about capitalism shaping a coming cybernetic world, but she also sees a liberatory potential to the cybernetic, And I think that's also the case. So, because the cybernetic also represents, on the one hand, it represents capital accumulation and the overgrowth of capital, and it can be used in an oppressive manner against working class people and oppressed people, and is regularly used in an oppressive manner. For example, in uh, software that determines hiring or profiles criminals, frequently the software is racist. Or it enacts racism that has been built into it. But it also has this potential, again, to make the transition to a truly abundant post-capitalist society possible, because you can instantly transfer images. You should be able to use that technology to cure diseases. The COVID vaccines probably would not have been possible so quickly without advanced computer technology, and that saved millions of people's lives. Contrary to whatever the conspiracy theory is right now about that. I think that we were supposed to turn into zombies this year because of the vaccine, but anyway. So there's this contradiction, and now it's in us, the contradiction between living labor and dead labor, the contradiction between, you know, the wealth we have constructed enslaving us and liberating us is closer to us on an intimate level than ever before. Um, um, and I don't have all
Yeah.
the answers to what that means, but I do know that it impacts how we move through the world and how we can think about things like emancipation.
Yeah, I mean, you bring that up in the book as well, this distinction in Marxism between living labor and dead labor, and it does seem like capital accumulation and the way it oppresses is more intimate than ever, and at the same time, creating a seeming global impossibility to do anything about it in a certain
Mhm.
way. So, as an artist, what are you? I mean, for someone reading your book, what is your hope for what they would take away as an artist or a philosopher or a theorist or whatever in regards to the basic message of Gothic capitalism?
Well, I hope they take a few things, I guess. I mean, the most important thing is to be doing your art, philosophy, and politics with the people around you in real life. I think. Not that you shouldn't do it with people elsewhere or online or write for journals, but I think that it needs to be performed in actuality in real life around you. But I also think
Like paying attention to the social relations aspect of this.
it's like the actual social
Yeah.
relations around you, not just in like in terms of theory and stuff like that. But I also think the reason for that isn't just like a moral one. I think it is. This is something Mark Fisher said, and I forget where it is, in which book, but we do. If even if the working class is no longer the social agent that can transform society, we will find out what the social agent that can transform society is by acting as if it is. Right? If we don't have a sense that there is an agent, a subjective agency that can transform this system, we will go into politics, we'll go into art, we will go into all these things without a transformative sense. And not only will that become self fulfilling, that we won't get to a transition, it'll also make the artwork and politics worse. Like, if you have a nuanced understanding of the idea of revolution, for example, I think you fight for reforms better in capitalism. If you have a crude understanding of revolution where you're ultra left and you think you know it all, then you won't. But if you want to fight as hard as possible to get the most out of every situation with a realistic appraisal of class forces, you're going to get a better result on a strike or a negotiation than you would if you're ready to compromise from the very beginning because you don't think you can win it all. And I think it's a similar thing with artwork. If you don't think you can transform society, if you don't think you can capture the face of God, to borrow an old expression, it's going to have a negative impact on the creation of your artwork. And one of the things I point to in response to the seemingly overwhelming nature of disaster, crisis, and digital media, which I call a sort of total art of capitalism or a digital Gesamtkunstwerk. Um, as I look back to the idea of the sublime and the romantics, that the idea of the sublime is this sort of terrible and beautiful thing uh, in nature, largely, that probably can't be captured in writing or in poetry or in art, but the attempt to capture it in art and writing and poetry was considered a kind of noble act by the Romantics, so like William Blake or the Hudson River School painters, landscape painters in the United States, or Caspar David Friedrich, the landscape painter in Germany, or Beethoven, the Romantics. Um, I think the counter totality to capitalist totality is kind of like that. And Marx literally talks about this. You can't, I don't want to, he talks about not wanting to make predictive formulas for a future socialist society against the utopian socialists, right? And it wasn't that Marx he also took a lot from the utopian socialists, but he said, we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Now, the way that's usually taken by vulgar Marxists is to not dream, but you had to argue against utopian dreaming. But what I think it means is the exact form of the revolution, what can undo this, what can save us from the Anthropocene, what can save art from this sort of crude cynicism. We don't know what that looks like yet, and that's fine. It's fine not to know. Imperfect verisimilitude was this idea in Romantic poetry that sometimes it's bad to be exact. Sometimes it's bad to be precise. And I think that's true in democratic social movements. I don't have to have all the answers because I have these 5 answers, and I can trust my comrades and other working class people to have the rest of the answers. And I think that's like conceiving a totality that's not reductive in a vulgar sense, but also isn't completely indeterminate, like in a post-structuralist sense, where it's just identities bouncing off each other in a void, right? Which is, I think, what a lot of people take, rightly or wrongly, depending on from Foucault. These are determined by capitalism. We don't know what a counter totality to capitalism looks like, but attempting to capture it, attempting to get to that point, is the noble act, whether you're talking about art or politics. But either one require a relationship to act, being in actual social relations as much as possible, and not just. And again, I'm not against art galleries. I'm not against the internet, but we can't just rely on these spaces that separate us from social context.
So it seems like there's a self-fulfilling prophecy at work if you, for example, think that your artwork can't transform society in some way. Like, is that basic? Like to sort of see your own belief and the way your own belief functions as a part of the process.
Yeah, instead of performing the sort of cynicism and uh, capitalist realism in everyday life, which we often perform, I think performing, like obviously intellectually, I know I make an artwork. I know that's not going to overthrow capitalism. That'd be ridiculous. No artwork can do that. But it can be part of a yet unknown totality that will, right? And so it's like if you think about a group of really good jazz musicians or the punk band, the Minutemen, they had this sort of rule that everybody they would alternate between the 2 people who wrote lyrics, who would write lyrics, and every other person had complete control. The drummer had complete control, the bassist had complete control, and the guitarist had complete control over what they did. So I think I'm playing some of these notes and doing my best to be a part of an ensemble that's still developing. Okay, buddy. Sorry, my kitty is. Sorry. Be part of an ensemble that's still coming together, trusting that other people will fill it out. But it's not just a gesture that's transparent and separate from the rest of the world, nor is it the thing that determines anything at the end. It has to be part of a larger group. And that's what we like borrow from the Carnivalesque. can't come up here, kitty. Differentiated totality is something we call it, or we look at the poet Richard Hamilton's idea of discordant will, or the artist Nupam Roy's sort of revised idea of George Bataille's excess, um, as what these things might look like, you know. Uh, and it's not just his hope, but as a sense that it is inevitable that the exploited and oppressed will begin to create these counter totalities, and we're part of helping shape that process. That
And
makes
in
sense.
regards to the way in which you're conceiving of art in relationship to the pre-modern and the modern, specifically the supernatural and the religious, and say the natural and the emancipatory,
Mm-hmm.
that comes out of the Marxist tradition. How do you think these two aspects should be operating in the present? Do you think there should be more solidarity and connection among working class people in regards to the religious and the secular, church spaces and non-church spaces? Is there some under sort of utilized resources among the working class that come from these distinctions between religion and secular, or the supernatural and the natural?
Well, I think that, I mean, whatever anybody does on Sunday, I don't mind one way or the other. Um, uh, I think that a couple things. I think we talked earlier about like the art space my partner and I work on is called Born Again Labor Museum, and that's a conflation of evangelical language, born again, with the Marxist language of living in dead labor, right? So, and it acronyms as BALM, which is about healing, and it's
Just Adam, we lost you for a second
oh,
when
sorry.
we lost you for a sec when you're about to describe the Born Again Labor Museum. Unfortunately,
Okay, so I was talking about how it's a conflation of evangelical language, born again, with Marxist language of living in dead labor. Dead labor being the accumulated wealth from previous generations of workers who were exploited, and living labor being the current generation of workers. And it was inspired by Michel Louis' reading of Walter Benjamin's thesis on history in a book called Fire Alarm. And Louis talks about Benjamin basically discussing an apokatastasis, which in theology is the redemption of previous generations of lost souls. So, for example, in Christianity, the idea that everyone who died before Christ gets a chance to be redeemed, and have eternal life, right? And of course, Benjamin had been a Jewish theologian before becoming a Marxist cultural critic. So it's one of the insights that Benjamin brings from that into Marxist cultural criticism. And we combine those things with the idea of, and then we like talked about Russian cosmism, this idea of redeeming previous generations, of stepping outside time as it is prescribed by capitalist realism, this sense of apocalyptic time, um, where you do feel like you can't do anything and everything is already decided. So I think that's sort of the starting point for me. Um, Whether or not religion is literally true or false or is not the most important thing to me. Um, and I've always had a problem both with fundamentalists as well as a lot of atheists, including comrades Marxists who are atheists, who take like literality to be more important than the philosophical and cultural questions raised by various artifacts and texts and poetry, and so on. Like the what is to me, like it sort of would be like going to see Hamlet and then having an argument about whether Hamlet was the exemplar of morality or whether Hamlet was real. Um, Whereas the important thing is, what does the play say about human beings, the people who made it? Why was it written at a particular time? What did it mean to the people who initially wrote it? This is what's important to me about the various books that later get aggregated in the Bible. What did they mean when they were made? What did they mean to people later? Why did people believe what they believed when they believed it? Um, and what is the pathos and the ethics and philosophy and theology that can be extrapolated from those things? I think that one of the things I really like about the art of a lot of hunter-gatherer societies is it rejects this false or this sort of wooden sense of realism or myth um, through the idea that things can be true and false at the same time, which I think is true of a lot of cultural artifacts. Um, you can put on a like people performing a ritual and aside putting on a mask and becoming a god. No, they're not really that god, right? But it's central to the ritual that they become that god in the ritual. They're and the idea that they um, are primitive and don't understand what they're doing has been projected on them by anthropologists in the West, and that's the way I look at a lot of this spiritual stuff, lowercase s, in terms of art. You can make a column pointing towards heaven or create a cathedral that captures the space that a cathedral captures without necessarily believing literally in anything, one way or the other. But the action has meaning, right, to the human beings around it because it's a human performance. Um, and so that's how I'm looking at it. Not as you, it's neither utilitarian nor is it subordinate to um, any one sort of like religious philosophy or not. I think there's value in most of them. You know, I mean, even like something contemporary, like relatively contemporary, like Mormonism. There's something kind of interesting about the notion that everybody gets their own planet. Like in heaven, like that's a really fascinating idea.
That's
If you
pretty
don't,
cool.
if you don't take it literally, like, but also don't get hung up on not taking it literally. You know.
Well, I think the final big question I have for you is basically the status of the working class and revolutionary subjectivity. You end your book kind of with the optimistic tone that, well, you say explicitly, only the working class can save us. And so, again, connecting, and I guess that's what makes this work ultimately within the tradition of Marxist historicity and revolutionary politics. Um, and you also stated, maybe 30 minutes ago or so, that acting as if the working class is the revolutionary subject will anyway necessarily reveal to us what the revolutionary locus is, even if it's not the working class. So how do you imagine that? And if the working class isn't the revolutionary subject, do you have any hypotheses about what is?
But I think the biggest problem we have now is time, um, because of the anthropocene, because of climate disaster, and because it's become clear to me that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, probably prefers authoritarianism as a way to manage a climate apocalypse over democracy for obvious reasons. I think if you're going to decide that large numbers of people are superfluous, um, you can't really organize that in a democratic fashion. That has to be organized in some authoritarian way. And I think that partly explains what's going on with Trumpism and the revanchism happening around Europe, possibly what's happening in Turkey the week we're recording, to some degree, as the background of it, not the immediate causes of things. I don't know. Like, I think it's going to be some combination if we are able to beat the clock and get to a post-capitalist situation before we no longer have the abundance necessary to create a truly democratic post-capitalist society, because that's what one of the other things being put at risk by climate change is having abundance so we can share it equally. It'll be some combination of the working class, the subaltern, the exploited, the oppressed. But the working class is the vast majority or the largest single social group on the earth right now in terms of relations to production. Wage earners are probably not the majority, but the plurality, followed by precarious informal sector workers, and then farmers. Um, and it's overwhelming together, the overwhelming majority. So we have to figure out a way to make common cause. The problem is like implementing that on the scale in the face of the kind of capitalist realism and the stultification of imagination that's been engendered, and now facing a growing far right and fascist threat. I'm not going to bet on it. I used to live in Las Vegas when I taught at the University of Nevada. I think my partner and I gambled $30 in 3 years, mostly waiting at the airport for flights. So I'm not really good on gambling or odds or anything like that. But I don't know. I can't think of any other plausible way out. People will look for salvation from above, like this country or that country, or perhaps aliens come and help us. I don't know, which is always
Right.
mythology in and of itself, because there's a left wing version of alien mythology and a right wing version of alien mythology, historically. But I don't see any other option. We know what happens when the realistic politicians get into office is 99 times out of 100 they betray the left, they betray the working class, they betray the oppressed. When Syriza was elected in Greece, they went along at the end of the day because they wouldn't fight the German central bank. They went along with austerity after fighting heroically for a few years against it. I don't see any other choice than to organize on the basis of the working class. I keep going back to the 18th Brumaire by Marx. First time is tragedy, second time is farce. The first time Napoleon comes in and undoes the democratic aspects of the French Revolution, it's a tragedy. Then it happens with his nephew after the 1848 revolutions, because the workers don't vote for their own candidates. They vote for the middle class. The middle class supports the landowners support the banks support the dictatorship. We keep having this pattern over and over and over again. I don't see any way out aside from breaking that pattern and the working class representing its own interests. I can't see another social force that can lead that. And that doesn't mean it's going to win. But I think I want to be with the people who can possibly get us out.
I have in my mind, because I have been at Philosophy Portal working with Chris Catrone and reading through the book, The Death of the Millennial Left. I've been playing with the idea of the resurrection of the millennial left. And I think that your museum called Born Again Labor points in this direction of resurrection, or some sort of revival of leftist politics. Is that where the name comes, and is the connection to Christianity sort of tongue in cheek?
It's tongue in cheek and not tongue in cheek, right? Like so. Um, it's a joke, but it's also not a joke at the same time, right? Like, I wouldn't, I wouldn't be like I said, I'm not really critical of religious people, and I don't like be we're critical of non-religious people or anybody for what they do on Sunday. Same way, I don't necessarily think that what's the content of somebody's artwork necessarily determines what side they're on politically. Like, I was joking with Mike Watson about like if somebody paints ducks all day, but they show up at the picket line to defend their immigrant neighbors. That's fine. Like there's a social aspect to art, but there's other questions. There does need to be a rebirth of the left. I think one of the disagreements I have with Caton and the platypus people, aside from I think some questionable positions on racism and imperialism, um, at best questionable positions, is the sense that it has to die first, because that's not how things work, right? Things don't completely die off and then completely come back. They're always sublated by the past. So whatever new left is produced is going to partly be born of whatever old left still exists, because that's the nature of dialectics and change and totality. Things don't just come fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. Sorry, kitty.
You're all good, man.
Right? So there's whatever comes next is going to be made up of what came before. You know, part of the process of that is going through what came before, and in terms of art, valorizing and exploring the cultural lessons in terms of politics, going through the political lessons, and understanding the nuance and differences of how those have shifted over the years. Because there can be a tendency on the left to assume everything is completely different, or to just bust out a quote from Lenin or something absurd like that. Like Lenin said this about it, and so that obviously is true for all times, right? Or to think everything's fundamentally different and none of that has any value for us, right? It's somewhere. It's a dynamic. It's not just in between. It's a dynamic between the thing. What is different? What has changed? What's the same? How do we apply the method that was used, if we agree with the method, to a new circumstance?
All sounds fair enough to me. I want to reiterate that Gothic Capitalism comes out May 2nd. There'll be a link in the description. You can pre-order it if you're interested in pre-ordering it, or by the time you're watching this, the book's already out. You can order it at the link in the description. Is there any final thought or reflection you'd like to share with the listeners in regards to either the book Gothic Capitalism or some of the themes that came out of our conversation today?
Well, I think the last thing I'll say is, like, just like an individual art object can't change the world, right? But it can be in concert with things that change the world. That's true of individuals too. Like, I can't change everything, but I can be with other people, and together we can change things, right? So I think that's like the central thing. There's a lot of other stuff being discussed, specifically about art in the book, about this sort of Gothic aspect of things. What are democratic aesthetics, which we didn't get into too much, but I think that that would be the main thing. I'd want people. And thanks for having me on.
My pleasure, and I recommend the work at Revolt Press in general. Had conversations now with Mike Watson and Brammy Gieben, and the work they're producing, I think, is doing in a meta sense precisely what I think you're pointing towards in the book, which is to revive a type of emancipatory imagination and collective imagination about our situation. You already referenced the perhaps a misattributed quote to Frederick Jameson about easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And so, I hope that the thread of thought that's being developed at Revol can hopefully lead to more context for discussing the precariousness of the present, and hopefully the reestablishment of a new future or building a new world. So thank you so much for your time as well and your work. And links in the description will be available, like I said, to your book and your other contacts. And for everyone who's been listening, thanks so much and have a great evening. Hey, I'm just going to here be giving an overview of the early Marx 101 course. This will be the next course I teach at Philosophy Portal, which is, of course, focusing on Marx's early works, specifically from the 1840s. And the logic of this course is basically extending Philosophy Portal's work, which, of course, starts with Hegel, working through the German idealist tradition. And inevitably, you become haunted by, or you feel the necessity to approach, the work of Marx. And I think that this course will be giving an interesting window into not only the early Marx, but the dialectic between Hegel and Marx, the dialectic between, let's say, German idealism and the Marxist tradition, which, from my point of view, has so many tension points and has such high consequences and stakes that I felt like this course required a full year to totally unpack and to work through. You can sign up here. It is starting with the critique of the philosophy of right, and actually is structured in such a way as that we are going to be going into multiple works by Marx, including the critique of the philosophy of right, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the German ideology, wage, labor, and capital, as well as the Communist Manifesto. And you can see the schedule here. It will be unfolding basically with events once a month from May 11th all the way to November 2nd. So we're extending throughout the entire year. I think that unfolding this course on a month by month basis is going to give us more time to digest these works, reflect on these works, and hopefully by the end of the year have a much deeper understanding of what Marx was responding to, both philosophically in the German idealist tradition, as well as socially and politically in his time and context, that is, approaching ultimately the revolutions of 1848 and the way in which Marxism and the Communist Manifesto specifically was key to a lot of leftist socio-political processes that unfolded in the last half of the 19th century. So again, you can join there. May 11th, we'll be hosting our first class focused on the critique of the philosophy of right. I actually made a video on the YouTube channel which is going into the introduction of the critique of the philosophy of right, so I recommend checking that out before the course starts if you're interested in joining, and hope to see you in class.